There is a bridge in Berlin, narrow, gray, spanning the Havel River between Potsdam and West Berlin. On most mornings, it looks like any other Cold War checkpoint. Concrete barriers, a guard post, the kind of place you would drive past without slowing down. But on certain mornings, mornings that happened more often than history books admit, two groups of men walked toward each other from opposite ends of that bridge. No weapons, no uniforms, just coats, and breath visible in the cold air, and the understanding that what was crossing that bridge in human form was worth more than most weapons ever built. These were spy exchanges. This is the story of the 5 exchanges that shocked the world, ranked by political consequence, diplomatic tension, and the weight of what each side gave up to get their people back. If you have never subscribed to History Unclassified, now is the time. Hit that button. These stories do not appear in the official record the way they happened. By 1962, the Cold War had been running for 17 years. Both sides had built intelligence networks across every continent. CIA officers in Moscow, KGB illegals living as ordinary citizens in New York and Washington, both sides capturing each other's people regularly. The question was never whether to negotiate. The question was always what they were worth, what you would give up to get them back. The Glienicke Bridge became the venue of choice because it sat exactly on the border between East and West. Neither side had to cross into the other's territory. Just walk to the middle, stop, and let the other man pass. Number 5 on our list established the template for everything that followed. February 10th, 1962. On the western end of the bridge stood Francis Gary Powers, CIA contract pilot, 32 years old, held in Soviet custody for 1 year, 9 months, and 10 days, convicted of espionage, sentenced to 3 years imprisonment and 7 years of hard labor. He was not supposed to be alive. The CIA had told Eisenhower that no U-2 pilot could survive a shoot-down from 70,000 feet. The aircraft would be destroyed. The pilot would be dead. On May 1st, 1960, all of that was proved wrong. Powers survived. The aircraft was not destroyed. The CIA cover story lasted 4 days before Khrushchev produced the pilot, the wreckage, and the cameras. The Paris summit collapsed. The diplomatic thaw that had been building since 1959 ended in a single afternoon. On the eastern end of the bridge stood Rudolf Abel, KGB colonel, 9 years in Brooklyn under the alias Emil Goldfuss, convicted of espionage in 1957, sentenced to 30 years. His lawyer, James B. Donovan, had argued against the death penalty specifically because he believed Abel might one day be useful in an exchange. That calculation was correct. Powers' father had written to Abel in his Atlanta penitentiary, his son for the Soviet spy. Donovan negotiated the terms through back channels in East Berlin over months. On February 10th, 1962, both men walked toward the middle of the bridge. They passed each other without speaking. What made this number 5 was not the men themselves. It was what it proved. For the first time, both sides had demonstrated publicly that they would negotiate for their people, that the bridge could work. Every exchange that followed was built on that template, but number 4 was different in almost every way, because the man at the center of it was not a pilot or an illegal. He was a man who had been inside the Soviet weapons program itself. Number 4 on our list did not happen on a bridge. It happened at Checkpoint Charlie, Berlin, October 11th, 1986. And it almost did not happen at all. The man the Americans wanted back was Natan Sharansky, not a CIA officer, not a military asset, a Soviet dissident. A mathematician and computer scientist who had applied to emigrate to Israel in 1973, been refused, lost his job, and spent the next 3 years working with foreign journalists and Western diplomats to document human rights violations inside the USSR. In 1977, the KGB arrested him on charges of treason and espionage. The U.S. government stated publicly that Sharansky had no connection to American intelligence. The CIA confirmed it internally. He was a civilian caught between two systems. He was sentenced to 13 years. 3 in prison, 10 in a Siberian labor camp. He served 9 years in total. In Chistopol prison and Perm camp, 35. Periods of solitary confinement lasting months. A hunger strike that ran for 110 days. A weight that dropped to under 100 pounds. He did not break. By 1986, Sharansky had become the most visible symbol of Soviet repression in the Western world. Ronald Reagan had raised his case directly with Mikhail Gorbachev. His wife, Avital, had spent 12 years lobbying every Western government that would receive her. The exchange involved 5 people total across 2 separate crossing points. At the Glinica Bridge, 3 Eastern Bloc intelligence officers were released by the West. At checkpoint, Charlie, Sharansky, and 1 other prisoner crossed in the opposite direction. The KGB's condition was that Sharansky could not walk in a straight line across the bridge. They did not want the image of him walking directly to freedom. Sharansky ignored the instruction. He walked in a zigzag deliberately, then straightened his path and kept walking west. He later said he did it because he refused to follow a single order from the KGB ever again. What made this exchange number 4 was the precedent it set. It was the first time the West had negotiated a spy exchange that included someone who was not an intelligence officer, someone whose value was entirely political, someone whose release sent a message not about espionage, but about human rights, about Soviet treatment of dissidents, about what the West was willing to pay to make a point. It changed the definition of what a spy exchange could be used for. Number 3 on our list was larger, more complex, and conducted under conditions of such tight secrecy that most of the people involved did not know the full picture until years later. June 11th, 1985. 23 people crossed in both directions at the Glinica Bridge in a single operation, the largest spy exchange of the Cold War. The centerpiece on the American side was Marian Zacharski, a Polish intelligence officer convicted in 1981 of stealing classified U.S. defense documents from Hughes aircraft engineer William Bell. Bell had handed over material on radar systems, the F-15 fighter, and anti-tank missile guidance technology. The damage assessment called it one of the most significant losses of defense technology in American history. In exchange, the U.S. received 4 Western assets who had been held in Eastern Bloc prisons. Among them was Jerzy Kaczmarek, a Polish officer who had been working for Western intelligence for years before his cover collapsed. The operation was coordinated through 3 countries simultaneously. American, West German, and Polish intelligence services all had pieces of the exchange. None had the full picture. Each side was managing its own part of the handover while the others managed theirs. 23 people, 1 bridge, 1 morning, no public announcement until it was already over. What made this number 3 was pure scale. The Cold War intelligence community had by 1985 developed the spy exchange into something approaching a formal institution, with its own protocols, its own back-channel negotiators, its own accepted rules about how the handover would be structured and who would be present. The bridge had become a mechanism. But number 2 on our list proved that the mechanism could break down completely, and that sometimes the most consequential exchanges were the ones that almost fell apart. Number 2 on our list did not involve a bridge at all. It happened in a Vienna airport hotel room, July 9th, 2010, and it was the largest spy exchange since the Cold War ended. 10 Russian intelligence officers arrested simultaneously across the United States on June 27, 2010. All of them illegals, deep cover agents living as ordinary American citizens for years, in some cases, decades. They had names like Richard and Cynthia Murphy, Donald Heathfield and Tracy Lee Ann Foley, Michael Zottoli and Patricia Mills. Ordinary names, ordinary addresses, ordinary careers in real estate, consulting, and finance. The FBI had been watching most of them for years, some for nearly a decade. The operation to identify, surveil, and ultimately arrest all 10 simultaneously was codenamed Operation ghost stories. It had run since at least 2001. The Bureau had placed physical surveillance on the suspects, monitored their communications, identified their dead drops, tracked their meetings with Russian handlers, and built a case so complete that when the arrests came, there was nothing left to contest. The most publicly recognized of the 10 was Anna Chapman, 28 years old, operating in New York under a British passport, running a real estate business, moving through Manhattan social circles in a way that generated contacts and access without requiring her to steal a single document. She was not the most valuable asset in the network, but she became the most visible face of it. The arrests came 11 days after the Russian president had visited Washington. The timing was deliberate. The FBI wanted to close the operation before the network could be warned. The visit had provided cover, normal diplomatic activity. Nothing to suggest the Bureau was 48 hours from rolling up an entire illegal network on American soil. The 10 were charged under the Illegals Program, a legal framework that had existed since the Cold War, but had rarely been applied at this scale in the post-Soviet era. None of them were charged with actual espionage. The Justice Department assessed that while the network had been active and operational, the material it had produced did not meet the threshold for an espionage charge under U.S. law. They were charged with conspiracy to act as unregistered foreign agents. The maximum sentence was 5 years. The Obama administration made the decision within days. The 10 would be exchanged, not tried, not imprisoned, exchanged for 4 individuals held in Russian prisons who had either worked for Western intelligence or been accused of doing so. The 4 coming west included Sergei Skripal, a former GRU colonel who had spied for MI6 from inside Russian military intelligence for years before his arrest in 2004. He had been sentenced to 13 years. He had served 6. The exchange took place at Vienna International Airport on July 9, 2010, 11 days after the arrests. The 10 Russians boarded a plane to Moscow. The 4 Western assets boarded a plane to the United Kingdom. The entire operation, from the simultaneous arrests to the completed exchange, took less than 2 weeks. What made this number 2 was the combination of scale and speed. 10 people arrested, 4 recovered. The largest post-Cold War exchange executed in under a fortnight. And one of the 4 who came west would later become the center of the most serious espionage incident on British soil since the Cold War. In March 2018, Sergei Skripal and his daughter Yulia were found on a park bench in Salisbury, England, both unconscious, poisoned with a military-grade nerve agent, Novichok, applied to the door handle of Skripal's home. Both survived. A British civilian who came into contact with the agent later died. Russia denied involvement. The British government expelled 23 Russian diplomats. 25 countries followed in a coordinated response. The 2010 exchange had returned Skripal to the West. 8 years later, the Russian state had reached across an international border to kill him in his own home. The bridge, it turned out, did not guarantee safety. It just guaranteed the crossing. Which brings us to number 1, the exchange that was not just the most consequential of the Cold War. It was the one that redrew the rules of what a spy exchange could accomplish and what it could cost. Number 1 on our list happened on August 12, 1986, not on the Glienicke Bridge, in Pretoria, South Africa, and it did not involve a single spy. It was a 3-way exchange across 2 continents that took 2 years to negotiate, involved 4 governments, and released a man whose value to Soviet intelligence had been so significant that Moscow had spent those 2 years refusing to discuss any other terms. The man the Soviets wanted was Gerhard Gardner, a West German intelligence asset who had been arrested in East Germany in 1984 and sentenced to life imprisonment for espionage. The man the West wanted was Oleg Gordievsky, not from a prison, not from a trial. Gordievsky had never been arrested. He had been the KGB station chief in London, one of the most senior Soviet intelligence officers in Western Europe. decorated, trusted, given access to the full operational picture of KGB activities across the United Kingdom. And since 1974, he had been working for MI6, 12 years. From inside the KGB, he had delivered the identities of Soviet intelligence officers across Europe. He had provided advance warning of KGB operations against British assets. He had reported on KGB assessments of Western intentions during the most dangerous period of the Cold War, including the period around Abel Archer 83, when Soviet leadership had genuinely believed a Western first strike was imminent. His intelligence had reached Prime Minister Thatcher directly. It had been shared with the CIA. It had contributed to American and British understanding of Soviet threat perceptions at a moment when those perceptions were bringing both sides closer to a conflict neither wanted. In 1985, the KGB recalled him to Moscow. He did not know why. He went. In Moscow, the interrogations began. Not formal charges, not an arrest, just questions. Long, careful questions from KGB counterintelligence officers who were building a picture without showing their hand. Someone had told them. The source of the leak was Aldrich Ames, the CIA officer who had begun selling Soviet assets to Moscow in April 1985. Ames had provided enough information for the KGB to identify Gordievsky as a probable MI6 source. Not certain. Probable. The KGB did not arrest him immediately. They watched him, restricted his movements, waited for him to make a mistake. He did not make one. Instead, on July 19, 1985, Gordievsky activated his MI6 escape protocol, a signal, a specific action at a specific location in Moscow, observed by a British intelligence officer who was watching for it. The signal meant one thing: extract me now. MI6 had prepared the extraction route years in advance. 2 British officers drove to a prearranged location in Moscow. Gordievsky was hidden in the boot of their car. They drove to the Finnish border. The car was stopped and searched twice. Both times, the guards did not find him. He crossed into Finland on July 20th, 1985. He was debriefed in the United Kingdom and remained in protective custody for the following year. The KGB announced his conviction in absentia in 1985. Sentenced to death for high treason, he was already in England. But his family was not. His wife and 2 daughters remained in Moscow. The KGB refused to allow them to leave. They became leverage. The price of his intelligence was the isolation of everyone he had left behind. The negotiation to recover his family ran for more than 2 years. It required a formal exchange. It required the Pretoria connection, the release of a South African-linked asset held by the East Germans, a West German intelligence officer, and 2 Soviet dissidents held in Western custody. 4 governments, 2 continents, 1 family being held as collateral against a defection that had already happened. On August 12, 1986, the exchange completed. Gordievsky's wife and daughters were released and allowed to travel to the United Kingdom. The family was reunited in London, but what made this number 1 on our list was not the rescue, not the escape, not even the 12 years of intelligence Gordievsky had delivered from inside the most closed intelligence service in the world. It was what his intelligence had prevented. Gordievsky's intelligence did not just identify Soviet officers and operations. It changed how the West understood what the Soviet leadership actually believed. In 1981, the KGB launched Operation Ryan, a standing intelligence directive requiring all KGB stations worldwide to monitor continuously for signs of an imminent Western first strike. Signs that included blood supplies at hospitals, lights on in government buildings at night, unusual movement of senior officials. The program reflected something the West had not fully grasped. Soviet leadership in the early 1980s was not performing fear for diplomatic purposes. They were genuinely afraid. The Reagan defense buildup, the deployment of Pershing II missiles in Europe, the aggressive rhetoric from Washington, from inside the Kremlin, it looked like preparation. Gordievsky reported all of it to M16. In November 1983, NATO ran a command post exercise called Abel Archer 83, a simulation of a full nuclear release sequence, realistic enough in its procedures and communications patterns that KGB stations across Europe reported to Moscow that it might be real. Soviet military units in East Germany went to elevated alert. Aircraft were prepared for deployment. The exercise came closer to triggering a genuine Soviet response than any Western official had intended or understood. Gordievsky's reporting told London exactly how close it had been. His intelligence was passed to the CIA. It reached President Reagan directly. Reagan later wrote in his diary that learning how genuinely afraid the Soviets were had changed his thinking. That he had not understood that his own rhetoric had produced real fear on the other side, that he needed to change his approach. The policy shift that followed, the opening of direct communication channels, the tone change in public statements, the eventual path toward arms reduction talks, was shaped in part by intelligence delivered by a man who had been a KGB colonel in London, extracted in the boot of a car, and reunited with his family through a 3-continent exchange that took 2 years to arrange. That is what made it number one. Not the drama of the bridge, not the scale of the 2010 arrests, not the symbolism of Sharansky walking in a zigzag to defy a final KGB instruction. The Gordievsky case changed the trajectory of the Cold War itself. The intelligence he delivered altered a president's thinking. The exchange that recovered his family closed the last chapter of an operation that had run for 12 years inside the most dangerous intelligence service on Earth. So, what do all 5 of these exchanges tell us? They tell us that the bridge was never just a bridge. Every crossing was a negotiation about value, what a person knew, what they had delivered, what they would deliver next, what their continued existence meant to the side that wanted them back and to the side that was giving them up. Abel and Powers proved the mechanism could work. Sharansky proved it could be used for something beyond espionage. The 1985 23-person exchange proved it could operate at industrial scale. The 2010 Ghost Stories swap proved it had survived the end of the Cold War intact. And Gordievsky proved that the most consequential exchanges were sometimes not about the person crossing the bridge at all, but about what that person had already changed before they ever reached it. The Glienicke Bridge closed to checkpoint traffic in 1990 when the Berlin Wall came down. It is now a public road. People drive across it every day without slowing down. Most of them do not know what crossed it before them. Gordievsky is still alive. He lives in the United Kingdom under a protected identity. He has never returned to Russia. In 2007, Vladimir Putin revoked the Soviet death sentence against him, citing the passage of time. Gordievsky did not consider it a pardon. Skripal survived the 2018 Salisbury attack. He lives in the United Kingdom under a new identity at an undisclosed location. His daughter Yulia recovered and returned to Russia. Anna Chapman returned to Moscow in 2010 and became a television presenter. The bridge still stands. If this is the kind of history you come here for, real events, exact numbers, no myths, then subscribe to History Unclassified. Every video is built the same way. The next one is already waiting for you.